Greetings and welcome to the Model Minority Myth and its Impact on Asian American Students panel. My name is Nicholas Hartlep, and I'm the Robert Charles Billings Endowed Chair in Education at Berea College. It is my great pleasure to serve as chair or discussant of this Leveling the Playing Field, subtitled Intersecting Race and Disabilities panel this afternoon. This panel is composed of Asian American scholars whose research backgrounds and lived experiences all qualify them eminently to comment on the focus of today's panel, and that is the model minority stereotype and its impact on Asian American students. It's my pleasure to introduce them in alphabetical order as they appear in the program. Our first panelist is Dr. Amardeep Callan. Dr. Callan is the Dean of the Technical Institute for Environmental Professions at Unity College in Maine. She has a strong interest in the Asian/American story in the United States. Her past and current scholarship examines implicit bias that shows up in the form of the model minority stereotype among Asian/Indian/American students and faculty. Dr. Callan co-edited the book Asian/American Scholars of Education, 21st Century Pedagogies, Perspectives, and Experiences, published by Peter Lang in 2018. Welcome, Dr. Callan. Our second panelist this afternoon is Dr. Guofeng Li. Dr. Li is a professor in the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Transnational/Global Perspectives of Language and Literacy Education of Children and Youth in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at University of British Columbia in Canada. Her program of research focuses on Asian immigrant students' bilingualism and biliteracy development and teacher education. Her recent books include Super Diversity and Teacher Education, published in 2021 with Routledge, and Educating Chinese Heritage Students in the Global Local Nexus, subtitled Identities, Challenges, and Opportunities, also published by Routledge, but in 2017. Welcome, Dr. Li. Our third panelist is Dr. Valerie Okapang. Dr. Pang is a professor in the School of Teacher Education at San Diego State University and former elementary teacher. She has published several books on social justice in education, such as Diversity and Equity in the Classroom, which was published by Cengage in 2018, and Multicultural Education, subtitled A Caring-Centered Reflective Approach. Dr. Pang has also published in journals such as Educational Researcher, The Reading Teacher, Harvard Educational Review, Multicultural Perspectives, and The Kappan. Dr. Pang has been a consultant for organizations such as Sesame Street, Fox Children's Network, Family Communications, the producers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and Scott Forsman. Welcome, Dr. Pang. Rounding out our fourth and final panelist is Dr. Gilbert Park. Dr. Park is an associate professor of social foundations and multicultural education at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. His research focuses on the school experiences of Asian immigrants and the potential for multicultural education to be used as a tool for advancing social justice. His research looked at the limitations and possibilities of Korean multicultural education for the children of immigrant mothers and North Korean refugees in rural Korean schools as a U.S. Fulbright scholar to Korea. Welcome, Dr. Park. So everyone knows this time together goes until 3:45. So we have an hour and 24 minutes. And so what I had planned was we will go through the questions and then we will have time to respond to attendees who have questions. So with the input of the panelists, we've co-generated questions for this afternoon's program. And with that being said, let's dive right in. But before jumping into the prepared questions, although I read your bio sketches, can each of the panelists please introduce yourself, specifically tell us your name and your position, tell us about your teaching and scholarly work, and if you feel comfortable, how you identify racially, ethnically, culturally. So let's begin with Dr. Park.
Yeah, there you go. My name is Gilbert Park. I'm an associate professor of social foundations and multicultural education at Ball State University. I teach undergrad courses and grad courses. For undergraduates, I work with pre-service teachers in the areas of school and society and multicultural education. And I do similar for grad students as well, too. My more recent research, I have been looking at on top of continuing my study of multicultural education in South Korea, I have been looking at the impact of pandemic on the rural white students, because I live in a very rural area. But my interest always has been on the experience of Asian American students. I have been working with Burmese immigrants for a few years, because Indiana happens to have a lot of them. And then I identify as Asian American, who happens to be Korean American.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Callan, would you like to go next?
Hi, so my name is Amardeep Callan. I am a dean at Unity College in Maine. So I'm a little bit different from the rest of this panel. I'm not actively working at a university researching Asian Americans, but that's what my dissertation was on, and that's what I published on after, because it's such a passion of mine to research this topic, the model minority topic, because it impacts us in so many different ways. And there's so many intersections between our identities. You know, how do you identify as an Asian American, as an Indian American? And then further, as an Indian American, you know, you face all the stereotypes of being an Indian American woman. Are you a traditional Indian American woman or not? You understand what I'm saying. So I'm very passionate about this topic, and I'm really honored to serve on this panel with such esteemed colleagues. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Lee, would you like to go next?
Hi, my name is Guofang Li. I'm a professor and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair here at UBC, University of British Columbia in Canada. My research actually has been really the heart of this topic. Right now, I'm working on a project entitled Behind the Model Minority Mask, examining Chinese Canadian children's language and literacy development in early school years from grade 1 to 3. The reason behind this project is a 5-year longitudinal study. So we're going to follow the kids through the school years in early elementary. The impetus behind this project is because we found in grade 12, there are assessments showing that they're not really model minorities at all in a very, very large sample across the school districts. So we don't know when this, some of the kids actually had advantage in English literacy when they entered the Canadian mainstream school. We don't know where in the school years from K to 12 that they start to fall behind. So that's why we started this project from early grades, from grade 1. We plan to follow them through grade 12. So this is, but in my past work, I have studied Vietnamese American refugee families. I studied Filipino families and Chinese American and Chinese Canadian families. So myself I'm a Chinese immigrant to Canada and the US. Before coming to UBC, I was at Michigan State and at SUNY Buffalo. So I'm all over the place. So thank you for having me here.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. And Dr. Pang?
Hi, I am Valerie Okapang. I'm a third-generation Japanese American. I grew up in Eastern Washington. We were the only Japanese American family there for 10 years at the time. So I have a very different background than a lot of other Asian Americans. My husband is Chinese American, so our children are bi-ethnic, they're Chinese and Japanese. I think it makes for a very powerful combination. And I teach classes on the doctoral and master's level. I have a master's program that's fully online. We started it in 2014 because teachers could not make it to the university and park right after school. It was just a nightmare for them. The traffic, the parking, all of that. So we developed a fully online asynchronous program. And it's, let's see, 7 years ago. So it has turned out to be fortunate because then everybody went remote. But the classes that I teach are multicultural education, curriculum, and instruction. My area is multicultural education, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have all the panelists here. I'd like to jump into the first question. And the panelists have seen the questions, so don't feel pressured to all have to comment on particular questions, but if one really speaks to your head and heart, please do chime in. So the first question I'd like to ask the panel is, first off, what is the model minority stereotype? And how is it dissimilar or similar to other racist stereotypes?
Okay, so I guess, Gilbert, were you going to go? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Please feel free.
I was just going to jump in and say this is something, the model minority stereotype, which many people assume is something very complimentary for Asian Americans, really is not. You know, as we know, we've all heard of Ellen Wu, who's the famous historian who writes on Asian American, and she writes that there are only two ways that Asian Americans have been viewed in US history. One is particularly Chinese Americans as yellow peril or as model minority, and both of them being detrimental to this population. The model minority stereotype really has roots in political, geopolitical, historic roots, where it was developed as a way to say, look at these Asian Americans, they don't need us, they don't go protesting in the streets to demand things. And here is other racist, racial minorities who are demanding things to be given to them, whereas here's this population that's hardworking. So it basically elevates to the surface a certain group of Asian Americans, but dismisses all others. Now, and I'll turn it over to Gilbert.
Actually, you said what I was going to say, but then I guess I'll comment on the next part about the similarities and this contrast. Is that I think it's similar in many ways to other racial stereotypes. Is because it's created by the dominant group to validate current white supremacist, the dominance of the system, in a way that how African Americans are stereotyped, Native Americans are stereotyped, other people are stereotyped. It serves to sort of give an excuse to why whites should dominate. In the same way, like what I cannot say your name. I am so sorry. What my previous speaker was saying was that it was created as a way to dismiss the claims that there's a systematic issue, especially during the civil rights movement when many people of color have been protesting. All of a sudden, Asian Americans are depicted as those people who do not complain, but quietly working really hard to make it. So there's no problem with the system. So similarity is that it created by and benefits the domination of whites, and also it validates their domination. More importantly, it shifts the attention away from the system, institution, into the individuals.
Dr. Pang, I see. Would you like to chime in?
Yes, I want to give the audience a more specific definition. I think the other two panelists gave a good context for it. I am going to use your Dr. Hartlep's definition in his piece, model minorities and overcoming the dominance of whiteness. So Dr. Hartlep said, the model minority stereotype is an oversimplified perception of Asian American and Pacific Islanders that casts AAPIs as the ideal minority population compared to other minority groups in the United States. The model minority stereotype promotes the idea that all AAPIs are achieving social, educational, and economic success, and that other minority populations should act similarly if they want to succeed. It is important to be conscious of the model minority stereotype, which has been critiqued as both a political tool to divide race-based coalitions as a rationale for denying AAPI inclusion, advocacy, and allocations of resources. Thank you, Dr. Hartlep.
Wow. Sometimes you hear your words, and yeah, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Pang. Would anyone else like to jump in with this particular question? If not, then we'll go to the next question. And also, if you're listening in, jot down some questions that you're thinking about. Right. Well, the next question I'd like to present to our esteemed panel is, how does the stereotype negatively impact Asian American students? And I didn't specify what students. You can be a college student, you can be a preschool student, but just generally or specifically, however you'd like to respond.
I can jump in on this question because that's one very important findings from my research. I want to emphasize, I guess, three aspects of the impact. One is academic, because the model stereotypes actually really affects how the Asian American students or Asian students in Canada and probably in other parts of the world, based on my 2017 book Around the World, that they have internalized the model minority stereotype and actually affects how they perceive themselves academically. So even with those high achieving students, they actually perceive them always not good enough. Okay, so one very important study from my 2017 book is from Australia, where they is in high school. They surveyed those students about their self-perception on their English literacy and mathematics and other aspects, and then they actually assessed them their actual performance. Very interesting contrast that the Asian Australian students actually perceive themselves as not good in English literacy. However, their scores actually exceeded the non-Asian students in the sample. So you can see that even though they're doing well, but then they don't think they're good enough, right? So this is one example of academic impact. And because of that kind of impact, they actually, it affected their motivation and goal setting for their later studies. So this is the part 3 of that study. Another impact is on the social emotional well-being that I think many studies have revealed that when they are internalized these stereotypes, they actually, because of the negative, they're not really good enough. So a lot of times they're psychologically stressed. So a lot of times actually putting a lot of pressure on the families and the students to achieve even higher. And especially, this is actually works for both, this way is working for both higher achieving and underachieving students. A recent study from here in Canada in my sample is that the students actually spend all their time trying to improve their math to measure up this Asian model minority or Asians are good at math kind of stereotypes. And what's happening is that their parents actually every day they come back to school, these students say, my parents, all they worry about is grades and math. So they put so much effort, so it's putting a lot of stress. So many of the students want to skip math just to measure up this model minority stereotype. In fact, their school counselors actually asked them to slow down. You haven't really got there yet. And so the students were caught in between the family pressure to move forward really fast and the school advice to slow down and really get a solid foundation in math. So you can see this is both academic and psychological. The third aspect, the impact, is actually on social equity issues. How a recent study actually based in the US surveyed college students where they asked Asian college students, the sample size is 251, so it's quite large. They asked them, they found out that the greater they internalize the model minority myth, the more likely they're resisting the Black Lives Matter, this movement and affirmative action. This is one. The second is that the more they internalize the model minority stereotypes, they're more likely to be colorblind. They think that the world is just fine, and it's just no racism exists. So I want to emphasize these three aspects for now.
Wonderful, thank you. Would any other panelists like to contribute to this question?
Dr. Lee has did an outstanding job portraying what happens to Asian Americans. So I'll talk about the other aspect of it. In a way that, like other stereotypes, it tends to dehumanize Asian Americans in a way that when people have multiple range of identities, as an example, white person can be all those. But then what the stereotypes happens is it limits the range of identities for people of color. In this specific case for Asian Americans are supposed to be the model, excellent students and all that. In the process, it essentializes Asian Americans, somebody other, which then leads to whose Americanness is often questioned, as in, can they be like us, real one of us, because they are so different. So on one hand, it dehumanizes Asian Americans. And also what it does is that because it essentializes Asian Americans, other people of color tend to see Asian American as somebody who do not empathize with their struggles. As a result, as an example, African Americans can talk about their struggles, and then Latin Americans and the Native Americans. It just so happens that model minority stereotype essentializes Asian American experiences based on success, is that they do not know what it's like to be a person of color in the United States, which then leads to struggle, not only difficulty many Asian Americans have aligning with other people of color in their struggle against systematic racism. Sometimes they become the target in a theory of model minorities, the middleman minority. They serve as a buffer between the dominant group and other marginalized group, where we become the target. I think the best example was during the LA civil unrest, when the Asian Americans, specifically Korean Americans, served as a buffer between protesting African Americans and the whites in Beverly Hills, where attention became Asian versus Blacks when it was actually white racism against African Americans. So I'd like to highlight those two things.
This is wonderful. When I'm thinking about how this panel has come together, I think I'm the youngest. I'm hosting, I get the pleasure of hosting, but these are all my elders. So as a doc student, I was reading the works of Dr. Lee, Pang, Dr. Park, and really came across Dr. Park's work because he was working with Dr. Stacy Lee. And so we have 54 attendees, whether you're a practitioner or a graduate student, please reach out to these elders. They're very friendly. You can collaborate on work and really take the study of the stereotype to the next generation. And I know they're all busy continuing to do work in the spaces they find themselves, but I just wanted to reflect on that. Amardeep, I saw that. I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, so fantastic points by both Dr. Lee and Dr. Park. And I just want to add on to that is the social and the domestic pressures put on students using this model minority stereotype as the backdrop. I've actually firsthand heard somebody telling their child, you gotta be, what are your teachers gonna think that you're Asian and you gotta be? And the amount of pressure that puts on the kids. One of the participants in my study said this was like death by 1,000 cuts. Living up to that level of expectation. And another participant when I did my study he said, when you go to a social gathering and somebody asks you how's school, the answer can never be a cursory fine or good. It has to be followed by explanations and examples of success, which can become so stressful that just the thought of going and talking to somebody about school itself becomes an event that induces great stress. And he says, so I've just stopped going to these gatherings.
Yeah, that's a lot of a burden for sure. Let's think of this question. And I'd like to hear from Dr. Pang first. Why do teachers need to know about the model minority stereotype?
Oops. Thank you, Dr. Hartlep. Why do teachers need to know? Teachers want to support all students, right? Not just some of them, all students, and that includes Asian American and Pacific Island. Education is not neutral. As a field, it contains many subjective and destructive beliefs, such as the model minority stereotype. And one of the destructive aspects is that racism is bimodal. It's just like what Gilbert said, it's white and black. That's not true. Of course, Asian Americans continue to feel so much discrimination, and that racism is many colors deep. I want to remind people that Stop Anti-Asian Hate, the group, has gathered up the number of incidents against Asians since up to March of 2021. It was 6,600. I know an Asian lady who lives in New York City. She's scared to go out, and she's probably about 55, 60. She's not really old or anything like that, but she feels that somebody might do something to her. And what's the Stop Asian Hate is they found verbal harassment, physical assault, civil rights violations such as workplace discrimination. Poon and her colleagues in RER, Review of Educational Research, talked about our children have been impacted by racism and prejudice and discrimination through avoidance, shunning, spit on, and, all those terrible things. A second reason that teachers need to know about the Asian American model minority myth is that they don't get services. There are a lot of kids who need special education, and I know some who were on the autism spectrum, and they didn't get any services from their school or teachers because they were Asian American, and people thought they didn't need anything. Another reason is, as Dr. Hartlep said in his piece that I talked about, go to his piece in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia on Education this year. And he talked about, it was interesting, a racist love, that whites reinforce white supremacy through the model minority myth and continue its domination of whiteness. The model minority stereotype is, as Dr. Hartlep explored, a successful minority, supposedly, who should be emulated, like tiger moms, valedictorians, engineers, and so forth. He has documented the model minority stereotype, showing over 600 articles in his model minority stereotype project. And I really like Dr. Hartlep's work because he has done a lot of data collection, and you can find this under nicholashartlep.com. And then also the model minority, why society pits, as us, our other columnists, our other panelists said, Asian Americans against other communities of color, saying, why can't you be just as so-called good? That means assimilated, like us, and emulate whites. And white, therefore, becomes the normal. White becomes the standard. And even though no matter how hard, Asians have tried to be successful and all that, they are continually seen as perpetual foreigners, and that we're all the same, though we come from many, over 50 different groups. And by pitting Asians against other groups, it creates a racial hierarchy of whiteness. And when Asian Americans emulate that hierarchy, then they assimilate to whiteness. As Dr. Hartlep says, we need counter stories of real people talking about their real lives to counter that. I also believe that the importance of disaggregate statistics. That means looking at not just all Asians as one large group, but putting them in different, looking at their performance by ethnic group. But that doesn't mean that there's one group better than the other. They're just different. So the model minority myth is extremely destructive to Asian American students, especially children who don't even know that's happening to them, and people, and it reinforces whiteness as the standard that should be emulated.
If I may add to what Valerie was saying, I think she's right on point. I agree. And I just want to say that it's an American issue. It's not an Asian American issue. It's an American issue, which then goes into what Valerie was saying in terms of a perpetual foreigner stereotype. My son is a third generation Asian American. He looks like me, but he's treated the same way by one of his classmates who just came to US 6 months ago, because it doesn't matter how long you've been here, you are foreigner. So by attacking model minority stereotype, I think it does validate who we are as Americans. That's one of them. And second thing is that, like with many stereotypes and racism and other isms out there, these do not happen in isolation of one another. They happen together. I'm specifically thinking about genderized race in a way that many Asian Americans are positioned associated with more feminine perceptions. And then a lot of the things that Asian Americans do experience, as in being overlooked, similar to what women are experiencing. So in a way that by looking at the model minority stereotype, I think we have a better understanding of just American struggles in general. And most importantly, to me anyway, this anti-Asian American hate that's been going on is just a horrible thing. Yet at the same time, as an American lived in Chicago, a large city, in Madison, Wisconsin, and now in Muncie, Indiana, this anti-Asian American hate is not new to me. There have been people where I have been targeted of racism, and people like me have been targeted as racism, sometimes more subtle, sometimes more blunt. It just so happens that what this has done, this anti-Asian American hate crime, has put a name on it. And then I think that the way it's put a name on it, the way it had not been getting attention, I think it's because model minority stereotype. While we deal with all these in our daily lives, the stereotypes put a blanket over it and saying, oh, look, they're doing fine. They don't need any help. So I think discussing and talking about model minority stereotype, it does address issues that we all face as an American. So I think it's an American issue.
It is. These are really good points. And one of the things that Valerie made a really good point is that Asians come from so many different countries. And when we choose to only accept one truth, and I put truth in quotes, and ignore everything else, the Ascend Foundation says that the lowest rung of the poverty ladder is actually Asians, not the way that not the popular narrative that's been thrown at us that it's either Latinos or Blacks. And those are the populations that are dismissed in this whole thing. It's very important to disaggregate. It's very important to recognize the different challenges that various Asian populations face. We've all heard of the attack on the Sikh Gurdwara in Wisconsin, and then recently the FedEx attack on a lot of the Sikhs who are working at that facility. In various ways, many different Asian populations face these challenges of the anti-American. Suddenly, Asians are anti-American on the one hand. So I don't know how you reconcile that. On the one hand, you are these model citizens. On the other hand, you are the un-American. So it's difficult.
So I want to add to the discussion, go back to the question, why do teachers need to know? So there are quite several layers of reasons. One is that non-Asian students really lack awareness of anti-Asian racism or microaggressions towards Asians. Several examples, like in early childhood, starting from early childhood, I'm in Vancouver. It is one of what's called the most Asian city outside of Asia, okay? However, if you read recent news report, this is the anti-Asian hate crime capital of the world, okay? So our anti-Asian hate crime has increased by 170% in the past year. So you can see that this is the larger climate. But back to the one lack of awareness is that in early childhood, there are students who, many of the parents actually in our neighborhood, share that they're Asian, a lot of Asian, Japanese, Korean, and including my own children who is mixed Asian, a mixed Asian and non-Asian, a Caucasian. So they came home and saying their students were laughing at their eyes. And so one preschooler came home, keep pulling her eyes to up. And so the mom said, what are you doing? She said, well, they're saying that I have weird eyes, the slanted eyes. So this is starting in early childhood, okay? And it's happening in elementary school. So I think teachers need to know how to, from early childhood to maybe in college, how to address those kind of anti-Asian microaggressions to help Asian students and non-Asian students. Those difficult behaviors and probably marks among. And the second layer is that many teachers have very mixed, complex or contrived ideas about model minority myth. On the one hand, they buy into this model minority myth. On the other hand, they also have, some of them unconsciously have unconscious bias. I'm going to just read two quotes from some of my research and some of the media. So one quote is from one of my works by one of the Canadian-born Chinese student. Say, I don't know if they did it. They here refers to the teachers. They did it consciously, but I guess they didn't make a distinction between the different races. I guess kind of by expectation, like they expect the Chinese students to do well, but I also expect them to be bad in English and stuff, like in social and humanities. This is one quote. You can see that this double sort of, you have on the one hand is model minority myth, on the other hand is not so much model. The second quote is from a national magazine that's very influential magazine, Maclean. In 2010, published some of the article called Too Asian. And this is from the counselors. One of the counselors said, the Asian kids are getting 98%, but they didn't have other skills. So the guidance counselor says, their parents would come in and write in their resume letters, and they were in the clubs. But the kids weren't able to do anything in those clubs because they were academically focused. You can see that teachers, guidance counselors have very complex, double, maybe multiple negative conceptions about Asian students. Even if you do well, then they say, well, what can you do? You only can get good grades. You're not good at anything else. So imagine this kind of attitudes brought into their classrooms and in their guidance counseling practices. A recent, the third layer is a recent from and a student had a racist remarks in a student, and guess what? Really did not address it. Sided with the white student. So, which caused double harm to this Asian student. So I think those are the reasons why teachers need to know. They need to know their own unconscious bias. They need to know what are the skills to help students getting maybe conduct this kind of difficult conversations. And they need to know strategies and ways to address those when conflicts arise. So I'm going to stop there. So there are many other reasons they need to know.
Dr. Pang, I see you want to contribute.
Yeah, I want to answer. I want to follow up with Dr. Lee's what she said. First of all, I was a first grade teacher, and I taught in a rural white agricultural area. And so the one day, Leslie, I still remember, she was doing that thing with the eyes that Dr. Lee talked about. And I was horrified. But I knew that I couldn't, and she was just sitting, Leslie was just sitting, a little blonde girl looking at another child. She didn't even know what she was doing. She had just seen it out on the playground earlier or something like that. And I was just panic stricken. So what I did was I stopped the class and I said, Leslie, what are you doing? She said, I don't know. And then she just kept doing it, And I said, do you know what that means? No. So I said, you are hurting Mrs. Pang's feelings so much. You are making fun of her. And she was horrified because she liked me as a teacher. She never really saw me. Initially, the children saw me as Asian American because they already know when they come at first grade, there are different races or so-called, different groups. So we talked about it. They stopped it. They didn't know it hurt somebody, and then they didn't know what it meant. A second thing I think we can do as teachers, teachers can do to mitigate this, is one of the things I noticed myself in my own classes, I call on male students more often than female. So this last time when I was teaching, I decided to call on Asian American students more often. And by mentally thinking about that, you realize you're not doing a good job. You're not doing it. You're calling on other people. It's, usually it's the more aggressive student or whatever, but I wanted to make sure that all my Asian American teachers in my class were getting equal time with my attention. So I think that is another way, whether you teach fifth grade or college students, you can begin to unpack this terrible way we have learned to ignore and forget that Asian American students need the same amount of attention as other students.
Those are great instructional actions. Thank you for sharing those.
Can I just add one thing to that, just very quick thing. One of the other reasons that teachers need to be really aware of the model minority is because, as I said earlier, it's manifesting in the home. And that manifestation from the home is carrying over into the classroom. And things from the classroom are carrying back to the home. So teachers really need to be aware of how kids are being impacted by the stereotype and by the expectations as well.
Absolutely. This next question, and all of the questions I'm putting in the chat, critical race theory has been receiving a lot of attention in the media. And so I'd like to think about this question in that context. I've received a lot of hate email by what I can only assume are white males, claiming that critical race theory is reverse racism. And so my question is to the panel, can a stereotype like the model minority stereotype be considered positive? And I use air quotes. Why or why not? And if you could explicate the best that you can, that would be beneficial for our audience.
If I may start, I did a study with the Burmese immigrants, and then I thought this was interesting idea to look at. Specifically, these Burmese immigrants are very, very poor, and then they live in a small city in Indiana called Fort Ray, not too small actually. And then they came from the refugee camp, and then some of the students did not even never attend that school. And then many of them, this modern amenities that we are so accustomed to was brand new to them. As an example, there was this story that I heard was that this student was so thirsty, but then she did not know how to use a water fountain. And then he found water in the toilet, so he drank that water. So it was because he never saw that before, right? So all these things are happening, and then it caused some harm, alarmed many of the white folks to the point that we started seeing no Asian allowed signs all over the city. And that's why I went to study Burmese. And as I was doing this, working with this Burmese immigrant students and how they are adjusting and how they're doing well in school, what I found was that against all these racist stereotypes and then the marginalization taking place both academically, socially at school, and then all those negative images that they're keep reminded of by their teachers and peers, only thing that was positive about the possibility of them being the model minority, in a way that with amongst all these negative images out there, they felt that one way they could portray themselves positively to themselves, to others, was holding on to the model minority stereotype. That does not mean that model minority stereotype has done them well, because there are a lot of problems there as well too. So in that situation, for instance, Asian American kids, Burmese immigrant kids could portray a positive image of who they were to other people. But then there were a lot of problems with that. As an example, as they were trying to embrace and hold on to model minority stereotype, what was happening was that they were building their own hierarchy. Specifically, that they carried over the ancient hatred they had in Myanmar to Burma. Those of you who know about Burma, is a very, very, very diverse place. And people have been fighting for a very long time and killing each other for a very long time. And then they were ranking one another according to their proximity to this model minority stereotype. And they were using minority stereotype as a way to sort of further distance others from the dominance or mainstream as a way to feel good about themselves, which I see in other groups as well too. So that's only one way I could see that model minority stereotype could be a positive thing for those of us who are so far marginalized when they had no other alternative ways of face-saving strategy. It could be that. But going to the critical race theory is that It's a theory that brings race to the forefront of analyzing and understanding the world around us. From that perspective, model minority stereotype has been very, very problematic as well too. And then I think I'll stop here because I think Dr. Pang and then Dr. Lee wants to talk. Where should I go on?
I'll tell you what one of the participants in my study said. I think the model minority stereotype is great. She said, because when I walk into a room, I'm already being perceived as a step above anyone else who's coming into the room. She says, so for me, it's great. But that wasn't the universal opinion I found. And there are studies, there's books written about this. The name of the book is The Asian American Achievement Paradox. That talks about how when students who were not performing well were placed into honors classes and placed into high achievement classes suddenly start doing well because they start getting that motivation of being perceived a certain way. And, it may be positive for some students, but for the most part, it's a very negative, very harmful stereotype.
I want to second that. In my study in inner city, in an American city, when I studied families from different racial groups, the African refugees, Vietnamese refugees, and Hispanic students, I found that the model minority myth is really internalized by the Asian families who actually have some kids succeeding, but majority of not. But the model minority myth also acted as a buffer for interracial relationships. For example, the Asian family said, well, we're Asian, so we don't make trouble. So that did bring them some advantages in workplace and sometimes in schools. When in workplace, for example, one parent said, I don't complain, so then then my boss will be kinder to me so that I can get more work hours. And so that sort of brings some very instrumental benefits, but only to a certain extent, because when something structural or systematic happens to their employment, then they just choose to, they can't do anything, right? Because they have been used to that role. And the same way with other families from other racial groups say, well, Asians are quiet, so they don't make trouble. So they are more willing for their children to be socialized with the Asian groups because they're considered good kids. And even though some kids, not all Asian kids are good, right? So in the like the traditional sense, so those are sort of very moment to moment instrumental positive psychology that brought by the modern minority myth. But on the other hand, parents are in those situation contexts, parents try to ignore the negative aspects of it, and also make them reason with how they internalize those stereotypes. So I think there are some certain groups and families, there's some beneficial moments and aspects to it.
Dr. Pang?
Unfortunately, I see more negatives about the model minority myth. One of the things that I see is some Asian American children, it becomes a target on their back. Other kids don't want to play with them because they're too smart, or they change. I always hear, oh, but you will make the grading curve higher and you'll make it harder for all the rest of us, and I even see in my own life, and I've talked with Nicholas about this a little bit, and I think Nicholas understands this, that as an Asian American woman, you can tell I'm not quiet if I have something to say. And when my colleagues expect that quiet, demure, kind of weak woman, they don't really know what to do with me. And I won't put up with it. I will, sometimes I'm very nice, but sometimes I'm very direct. And that puts the model minority stereotype. I don't fit that. But their expectations. So in high school, if a student speaks out more, then that student may not be accepted, may not be listened to, may not, be understood. I mean, I should be able to say whatever I think just like anybody else, right? And yet, they're not like that. I get a lot of microaggressions. I know Dr. Lee talked about. I get a lot of it, and the faculty don't realize their nonverbal behaviors, just a twitch of the eye. I see it, and I'm like, oh my God. But I'm just who I am, and I'm lucky enough to be so old that I can say, a lot of things if I think it, and that's an advantage. But children don't have that. Even college students often don't have that. So I think it puts a target on people's back too.
I was going to just add on to what Dr. Peng was saying. I mean, I don't want you to walk away from this talk of what I said about Burmese as if the model minority stereotype save Burmese students. It really is not. It's that so those students who embrace that as a face-saving strategy, what was happening was, they may think that they might be. It just so happens that others will not see them as a valid model minority. That's one of them. And even though they feel that they could work hard and overcome this negative image of Burmese, all that stuff, as far as they could only go up to a certain level, because ultimately they will not be embraced as one of their own. If you think about it, the face-saving strategies through the critical race theory anyway, it's not unique to model minority stereotype, right? If you can look at the African American stereotypes, whatever that it is. If you think about this more hyper masculine stereotype, we know all the harms that it does to African Americans. Yet at the same time, there are African American males who embrace that because they think there's a positive in it, and there are positive in it. They might be more attractive. They might be more, So there are some positives there. It just so happens that it could only go so far because whatever positive associated with that comes back and put them in jail, literally.
I never, listening to you, Dr. Park, my mind shifted a little bit. I never gave that much thought, but so I learned something when you just shared. Thank you.
So this, Nicholas, what we are talking about of this perception that there's a target on the back, you're very smart, but you have to be meek. This carries on into the boardroom, from the classroom into the boardroom. 60% of Asian Americans get a bachelor's degree compared to only 41% of the general population. Yet there are only 6% of Asian Americans in executive positions. We've all heard the bamboo ceiling, and that comes from this whole perception that you're smart, but you don't have the leadership skills. You're smart, but you're meek. You can't talk. You can't converse. So there's all these other stereotypes that go with it that are perpetuated. It's not just one container that we can put model minority in. It leads to all these other ripple effects that go very far beyond just the K-12 or just the post-secondary education.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. We're doing really good on time. I'd like to pose this last question to the panelists and then open it up to the audience. You've been doing a great job. If there are questions from the floor. And so let me broaden our lens for a moment and contextualize this question to something we can all in the room think about. During the COVID-19 pandemic, how have Asian Americans been stereotyped?
we're just foreigners. We cannot be American. We're a threat. I think that's what it's very antithetical to the modern minority stereotype, right? The notion is that, through hard work and perseverance, you will be American. That's the myth of modern minority stereotype. Yet that stereotype always coexisted with this Tuan calls a forever foreigner stereotype, or perpetual foreigner stereotype, where we just cannot be American. And then what's really interesting here is that, what was discussed earlier, the power of the stereotype is that it dehumanizes, and then it's created by the dominant group for other people. Just like that, conveniently, the dominant group dropped modern minority stereotype, and then we saw it as a threat. And it did not matter. You might be fifth generation Japanese American, or first generation, or even just immigrant from Burma. That you are a threat. You're not one of us, and you carry the germs, literally. So I think that's pretty sad. And if I may say one more thing, and what really disheartens me is that it happens within Asian American community as well too, where we internalize that, we view that about others. So not only does it marginalize us from the dominant group and other people of color, we also take part in the process where some of us are not good enough, or they're not really one of us. And I think something that we as Asian American community has to overcome for us to be a viable voice in this process.
I think we're back to the yellow peril.
Yes, we were the invisible minority first, and then suddenly we're not invisible anymore. And with all the new variants of COVID coming out, I have, during the pandemic, I've heard several times, go back to your country. This is my country,
I was so sad when the 6 massage owners in Atlanta were shot. And then they said, oh, it might not be. The guy just had a bad day. I'm thinking, what? 6 out of 8 victims were Asian American women? It doesn't, you see how our characterization has made such a huge difference. We're foreigners, we're different, we don't belong. I think we have to get more politically involved. I think Black Americans have really taught everyone that if you want to do something, you have to get involved in politics. So even though I saw Andrew Yang didn't win in New York City, he was out there. He was talking. He was, trying to promote equity. So I thought that was good.
Yeah, that's really a hard topic for my community as Korean Americans. And I think there's a prime example of how modern minority stereotype has dehumanized Asian American women, so that when a white person has a bad day, 6 Asian American women dies.
It's the same thing that happened in the FedEx killing. It was 6 Sikh people who died, basically. And again, they said the same thing, that he was just disgruntled with his work. You don't go target people of a certain race. Anyway, that's a whole different panel.
A few days ago, a PhD student from the United Kingdom spoke with me about her research, and she was looking at how COVID has been racialized and Asians have been racialized through the transmission of disease. And I'm no expert, but I had done some research, and I had seen images. And if you look long ago, there were images of unclean Asian American, Chinese Americans, and then the whole thing with Wuhan and Corona-19. So thinking about the online, all of the negative images, very disgusting. I saw ones of, females eating bats and looking very bloody and stuff, very vile. And so as the panelists have said, at this moment, it appears that there is a fear and a yellow peril for Asian Americans. Tessa, I'm not sure if there's an American University facilitator listening in, but we do want to open it up to to others who have questions. I'm not sure how we can do that. I put in the chat. If there are questions, you could type them in.
There are several questions in the Q&A.
Oh, in the Q&A? Okay. Oh, lovely. Okay, perfect. We'll just go in the order. T. Gentry writes, however, doesn't this mindset / challenging model minority myth begin at home? I have had many discussions with my Asian American friends regarding the expectations. If I press the answer live, will that broadcast it? Are the panelists, are you able to see the questions? Yeah? Okay, so whoever would like to respond to T. Gentry's.
If I may, I guess I'll go with the first one. Doesn't this mindset, challenging minority myth, begin at home? I do agree. It should happen at home. It just so happens that that could be a very, very, very easy excuse for us to not do anything at school. So, yeah, all this racism, sexism, whatever it might be, I'm not even sure if it starts at home. Does it start at the society? The chicken or the egg, right? We have to start somewhere. And then we in schools, I think we have the responsibility not only to deliver academic content to our students, but create a safe learning environment where all of our students can succeed. So I think school has to be a place for it.
I want to jump in because I recently did a workshop with in a school on this topic. The school, first of all, most of our the teaching force in both United States and Canada are majority white, middle class, if not mostly female, I would say. So I think that minority teachers are really a very, very small fraction of the teaching force. So we have both responsibilities in the home and school to do that. I think with a lot of the Asian communities and the schools who are what I call mainstream schools, is that there's a really disconnect between the Asian families. A lot of the reports have been showing that there's lack of parental involvement and engagement between, engagement of Asian families in the school context. However, a lot of Asian families are characterized as over-engagement in the home, okay? So there's also a cause and effect because of a lot of Asian, especially newer families, they lack understanding of how school works. So they practice a lot of the cultural ways of schooling or parenting at home. So I think that teachers actually in the schools lack understanding, for example, in the question about the expectations set by Asian American parents, right? So how there's a lack of mutual understanding of the cultural practices. I think in any educators involved with having to educating Asian Americans now need to have a sort of homeschool dialogue on expectations, on cultural practices. So I think that's the way to go. So it's not just start at home or not addressing in school. Is really, I would say, it's a concerted effort. It needs concerted effort.
I want to interrupt and make two announcements and then come back to the panelists. One was, and it's in the Q&A, Jen Pang mentioned there is a good new children's book called Eyes That Kiss in the Corners by Joanna and Dung Ho. So if you're listening and that interests you, you should look it up. I'm definitely going to as well. The book, if you want to write it down, it's entitled Eyes That Kiss in the Corners. And it's written by Joanna and Dung Ho, H-O. And so I just clicked the button that said we answer that question. Dr. Ellis, Antonio Ellis at American University, who really spearheaded today's event, wanted me to tell everyone, because I know the attendance kind of goes up and down, that there is model minority literature and books available under the resources tab on the SIEEJ conference website. And also that Teachers College Press is making a 15% conference discount on the conference website. So definitely take a look at the website for the conference. All right, panelists, coming back to you. There's some more questions. Antonio Ellis asks, are females stereotyped more than males within the model minority stereotype, in your opinion? Who'd like to respond to that?
Go ahead. I'll go after you.
I was just going to say that it depends on which Asian subset you come from. And there is an expectation to be this good female, this good woman. And there are also several expectations within the model minority of, well, you're a woman, so you're going to do well in school, you're going to get a good job, then you're going to get married, then you're going to produce 2 beautiful children, you know? So that is, there is definitely, I know in some subsets of the Asian American community, there is definitely a different set of expectations for women than for men, and the expectations for women far outweigh, as far as social behaviors and social norms go, than men.
I was going to say that I think it affects people differently, like what you said. I 100% agree. Is that one thing we have in common is that how this racial stereotype of Asian Americans in the United States anyway, with the help of model minority stereotype, is that it feminizes Asian Americans in general, right? Just so happens that for Asian American women, not only are they feminized, they're hyper feminized. So that we have this dual image of one absolute silent, submissive woman. At the same time, we have this highly exoticized, sexualized woman. So it affects Asian American women in a bad way, no doubt about it. Yet at the same time, feminizing Asian American males, it has its own negative impact as well too, where their masculinity is always being questioned, right? Or their heterosexuality is in question. They become less desirable. So I guess my answer to that is that I don't know if it affects Asian American women more. I think we impact Asian American men and women in a very, very similar yet very different way. I think that would be my response to that.
There's a comment that Joanna Ho has another book coming out, Eyes That Speak to the Stars. So if you want to write that down, Eyes That Speak to the Stars is another book. There was a question in the chat. What has been your experiences in working with Asian and Asian American school-aged students and their families in terms of accessing special education services, supporting students with disabilities, etc.? And how might this connect to the model minority stereotype too? What are your recommendations and resources or research on the best practices for educators and counselors working with Asian and Asian American students and their families?
My experiences haven't been very positive. I know, first of all, parents don't want to really put their children into special education classes because it is contrary to what they've been taught, that their child should be smart and they should be, very fabulous at sports and everything. So I think a lot of parents are against putting their child in special education, and Asians are difficult to deal with that way. And I think also they don't know the process. They don't understand the system of school. So they don't know how to get their kid in. If they want special education services, they don't know how to get those services. I worked with a child for a whole year who had at that time called Asperger's. And it took almost a whole year to get services for him. And it was only after we called in some folks from special education people from the university that the principal would then consider it. The child went almost a whole year without services. It was terrible. I mean, I was in there 2 hours a week working with him, but I'm not a special education. The teacher just asked me because I was Japanese American. He spoke Japanese, Spanish, and English. Now tell me, could a child trilingual? They didn't, they just had such negative views about this kid. It was just disturbing. I know another situation where the young man also was in high school, and this high school had a lot of services, but the parents did not want their child in any special education classes. So it's not just teachers and educators, it's also parents. Going back to the what Dr. Lee said about teaching them about the negatives of the model minority. They don't know. They haven't had the opportunity to hear any other ways to think about it. They think it's good. It's just like a lot of people used to call themselves Oriental, and I would say you're not a rug, you're Asian American, but they didn't get it. It took a while before. I don't think people talk like that anymore, so much anymore, but it took a while.
Also, parents tend to perceive if the child has to go into special education or needs special services, parents tend to perceive it as their failure as a parent. That I somehow failed as a parent. And that is, again, that's what I was saying, is that those are the tentacles of the model minority myth extending out, where the parents hold themselves also to this high expectation that I have to be this perfect parent to produce this perfect child who will be this perfect citizen.
On top of the stigma associated with that and parents blame themselves, I also want to highlight the fact that this what model minority stereotype does is that if you work hard, you could make it. So it's almost as if the students can work hard to overcome their disability. We just...
Or as in depression, that's another whole stigma with Asian Americans saying, just smile, just think happy thoughts, just go do exercise. But just don't tell anybody that you are going through mental health issues.
Yeah, I want to mention.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just 2 points. One is the special education, the concept of special education is very cultural, right? So I know that historically, even now in Chinese education system, they are starting to look at special education in a new way. Before that, it was only for special education for those severely disabled. Like, for example, if you're blind, if you're mute, those are considered disabled. If you are just the cognitive disability, it is a newer concept that parents and educators are beginning to understand. So bringing those cultural perceptions, I have the experience with very extremely well-educated parents who had, for example, a kid with dyslexia. So the teacher actually punished the kid to copy a sentence like 1,000 times, okay? And of course, the kid did well into the wee hour of the night. Next day, and went back to school, is exactly the same. So to the point that it's really emotionally distressful, I would say the understatement in use distress to the kid and the family. But they didn't know about dyslexia. Even those parents are actually like college professors. Okay, so just to show you that there's a lack of cultural understanding of cognitive disability. So bringing that into the Western education system, which actually very much focused on inclusive education. So the cognitive disability is way more advanced than some other cultures. So I think that there's a lack of a cultural understanding. The second is that the point that the cultural another cultural point is that they think that if you work hard, you can overcome those cognitive delays, right? So that's another reason to for parents who are reluctant to do the to enroll in special education. The third aspect is that because of this face saving, the cultural reasons, Asian American or Asian Canadian or they are actually, there's reported they're 30% of less likely to ask for special services and programs. And even mental health is a taboo, right? Mental health issues is only recent, very attention to the severity of the mental health issues is very recent. So I think that those are the things that you need to really parental education, even parental counseling, really think of a more open or ways of sharing information to educate parents about special services, disabilities, and it's really need to reciprocal understanding of both the Western and cultural ways of approaching disability. So I would recommend, there's a book, resources for culturally reciprocal approach to special education by Ruth Harry, Dr. Ruth Harry from Miami University.
We're getting close to time. Panelists, could you, if you feel comfortable, put in the chat different ways that people can get maybe your email. I know people are listening to your thoughts and might ask you for, what was that article you mentioned? I'm not sure how the website will, share this if our names are there, but please reach out to these experts, subject matter experts. If you have questions or, I'm sure they'd like to speak, your classrooms and what have you. We can go to the question and answer. There's a question Karen Breslin asks, how do we as educators, and maybe we've answered these, but how do we as educators counteract these stereotypes, whether it's in our classroom or our family, social gatherings, and even as teachers in our own schools? People do verbalize and think these stereotypes. Many are ingrained in American culture. So what do you suggest we do?
And we do exactly opposite of what it does to us. Instead of dehumanizing Asian Americans, we humanize them, grant them the full range of identities, and in the process, normalize them as Americans.
Yeah, lots of teachers don't know that they could put up so many posters in their classroom of different Asian American leaders, like Patsy Mink. If you're a woman and you got a scholarship since 1972 and you did something, you got to work more or at the college, or you were part of the basketball team or the swimming team or what, it's due to Patsy Mink. They're actually renamed Title IX after her. There's lots and lots of other people that we could talk about. And as Jen Pang gave you one children's book, I think literature is a great way. So I was just thinking of some of the ones I know. A Different Pond is really a good one about Southeast Asian father taking his son to go fishing. It's beautifully done. It's not stereotypical. I'm not talking about Chinese New Year or anything like that. He took his son out to catch fish, and he told him that it's not for sport. When he was in Southeast Asia, they did it to survive. There's another one, Sherry Garland's The Lotus Seed. I like No No Boy by James Okada. It's more for high school. It's for older students. It's about somebody during World War II who said no to questions 27 and 28 on the about loyalty of Japanese Americans when they were put in the internment camps, then they were put in jail. So it's about that. There's so many new ones. A good author I would really suggest for middle to high school is Stacy Lee. Not Stacy Lee, the one who does scholarship. It's Stacy Lee with no middle initial. She writes fabulous novels that are very engaging about like the San Francisco fire in 1904 and how it engaged the Chinese American community. I highly recommend her.
Wonderful. Some of the panelists, if there are other books, there was a question. Someone wanted book ideas, website links that you can think of. I'm going to go ahead and say that we answered that question. There are 2 questions in the chat. Debbie Goddard asked, how can you use the myth to your advantage? I think we've kind of talked a little bit about that. And since we only have 2 minutes left, we won't go to that one. And then Serena Lau commented, I appreciate the comments made by the panelists about how to address the children's anti-Asian comments behaviors, but how can we as educators address what when it comes from the home environment? So what I want to encourage all of the audience to do is to be brave and email one of the panelists, ask them a question, thank them for their time, engage. It's a small community. All of us are educators. If you're attending today's conference, you're committed to inclusion and equity and justice-oriented living. And I'd like to also thank the panelists for your time. That's the amazing thing about Zoom. We can all be linked up. It's quite amazing. Whether in your Muncie or Maine or Canada or San Diego, I'm in Wisconsin right now. So I'd like to thank you all, give you a applause, and thank the audience for attending and listening and learning. Thanks, Tess, and thanks, Dr. Ellis, for having this space. I'm not sure what you need from us, Tess. Are we able to just close out, or they're recording on their end, I think. So I guess.
I just want to say it's lovely to meet all of you, and it's lovely to serve on this panel. Thank you.
Same as well. Thank you. I learned a lot from your perspectives. Thank you.
Learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.